Good evening. It's almost time for Halloween, and you know what that means. Pumpkin spice fever. It spreads through the population like wildfire. It's everywhere this time of year, and symptoms include turning into a spiced pumpkin that bobs through the air. So don't forget your pumpkin spice booster shots. They can be found at your local bog. At Halloween, the city turns into cardboard, the money turns into a weird cheese, institutions are found to be lame board games, and everyone finally gets the chance to take off their costumes, to run wild through the woods and smear feces on themselves. Meanwhile, all of the other animals start walking about on two legs and dressing up in fancy suits and dresses. They all start lining up at Starbucks to order pumpkin spice lattes through sequences of yips and chirps. This is the best time of year because it's the only time when real disclosure happens. And meanwhile, real monsters get approached at parties and asked what they're supposed to be. And then they're forced to stand there awkwardly and say, I'm not wearing a costume, I'm just a werewolf, or I'm just Logan Paul, or whoever they happen to be in real life. Yes, Halloween is a special time of year, but only if you can avoid the pumpkin spice fever. You know what my favorite thing to do on Halloween is? It's to go out at magic hour and watch the flimmery ooshes at sunset. That's what I like to do. And once that great pumpkin in the sky smolders in the pumpkin hearth, I slough off my non-Halloween costume and turn into a tiny, glowing bat with the face of a cat. Meow. Uh-oh, Jeff Knox tracked down some wild bubbles, but then he accidentally popped them. The evidence quickly dissipated. And how does misinformation spread? It turns out that misinformation currents are generated in the phlogiston due to the Earth being flat. At least I think that's right. Plus more balloons. Lots and lots of balloons. Thousands upon thousands of balloons. Billions of billiard balloons to haunt my nightmares. All this and more tonight. I'm Rachel Nelson.
I'm the green alien, the little green man visiting from outer space.
Luis Cayetano, dressed up in a very clever costume, the Invisible Man. Welcome to Ufo Sunset. And now for balloons in the news, a rebrief special report. Balloons flew over the annual Nevada Day Parade Saturday. Nevada Day. Nevada Day is a holiday that commemorates the founding of the state of Nevada on October 31st, 1864. The Nevada Day Parade is an annual festival celebrating the event in Carson City. On Saturday, thousands gathered to celebrate, and among the festivities, there was a balloon launch at 6 a.m. Hot air balloons, including one sporting the logo Remax to advertise for the Remax real estate company. Although the festival is over, ending with a trash cleanup this morning, there will be trick-or-treating on Halloween night, which includes trick-or-treating at the governor's mansion. The governor of Nevada, Joe Lombardo, and his wife, Donna Alderson, will hand out trick-or-treats to children at the historic mansion. North Korea dropped propaganda leaflets and trash on Seoul. On Thursday, the Presidential Security Service in Seoul reported that balloons sent from North Korea dropped trash on South Korea's Yongsan presidential office, the office and residence of the country's president, currently Yoon Suk-yeol. At the same time, balloons also dropped propaganda leaflets in Seoul attacking President Yoon Suk-yeol and First Lady Kim Kyung-hee. Excuse my pronunciation. According to Al Jazeera, Kim Yo-jong, the sister of North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un, said that South Koreans dropped rubbish in North Korea earlier in the week. She was quoted as saying, quote, "The reckless infringement upon the sovereignty of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea by the Republic of Korea military gangsters is a hideous military provocation that can never be pardoned," unquote. This latest incident comes after numerous previous instances since May in which Pyongyang has dropped leaflets in the South Korea, responding to South Korean activists dropping leaflets in North Korea. North Korean balloons also previously dropped trash on the presidential compound in July. Sorry. Taiwan unveiled a new tethered high-altitude balloon. Taiwan's Ministry of Digital Affairs unveiled a new tethered high-altitude balloon on Thursday. The balloon will help restore communications after a disaster. According to Taipei Times, the Minister of Digital Affairs, Huang Yen-noon, said that this is only one of multiple solutions to restoring communications in Taiwan, a country which is prone to natural disasters. The balloon was developed through a collaboration between the Technology Research Institute, the National Taiwan University of Science and Technology, and the National Taipei University of Technology. It can reportedly reach an altitude of 800 meters, remaining in the air for 2 weeks, and provide coverage for 380 square kilometers. The balloon was unveiled at a ceremony in the Luye Highlands of Taitung County. And now, for balloons, a flying menace, Part 2. There's no place like balloons. In 1914, actress Pearl White got the starring role in a new adventure movie serial called The Perils of Pauline. While many people today might watch a silent movie serial from 1914 and find themselves bored to death, back then this was the bleeding edge of mindless entertainment. People loved movie serials and would return to the cinema again and again just to find out what happens next. And Pearl White, a young actress already experienced both on stage and in standalone movies, was adventurous in real life. It was only natural for her to star in her own adventure series, 1914's answer to whatever it is the kids are watching nowadays. Excuse me. Her new role as an action star also challenged the stereotypical fair maiden characters popular till that time. She was a new type of star for a new era. Sadly, during the shooting of the very first chapter of The Perils of Pauline, disaster struck. In this episode, the heroine Pauline only intended to go for a joyride at the fair, but according to historical records, the story goes that her safety line is cut by a villain and she is set adrift. But for this sequence, Pearl White was filmed in a real, free-floating hot air balloon and was caught in a storm during the shoot. That's right. This would have been one of the earliest depictions of actual human flight in a fictional film, where someone was filmed literally flying as a practical effect. This wasn't just a simulation of flight, but the real thing. Pearl, along with a balloonist hidden in the carriage, were startled to find the weather turn as they drifted over the Hudson River from Palisades Park. Immediately, they got caught in a storm. The subsequent tragic events were later recounted as followed by the sole survivor of the incident. Quote, "About 10 minutes after we were cut loose, a sudden storm broke. It was April, and this was a good old-fashioned April thunderstorm with rain, wind, lightning, and all the trimmings. I don't suppose it lasted over 20 minutes, but they seemed to me like 20 years. We were drenched to the skin and half frozen. In order to rise above the storm, we threw out ballast and got up to about 5,000 feet. Then, when the storm passed and we wanted to come down, we found that we were over New York City. We did not dare to descend there. The balloon might land on the edge of a 20-story building and tip us into the street." For 3 hours and a half we were in the air, most of the time over the city, although once we were carried 2 miles out to sea. But we didn't dare to come down in the water, of course. Most of this time I was busy tearing a long roll of tissue paper in pieces and dropping them over the side of the basket. As they fell, they would show in which direction the currents of the air below were moving. There seemed to be different levels on which the currents moved in different directions. At first, we would throw our ballast in order to rise, or would let some of the gas escape in order to descend. In this way, we jockeyed around, trying to get into a current which would carry us to a safe landing place, but we couldn't make it. Finally, all the ballast was gone, and to complicate the situation still more, the bag was leaking gas. We had settled down until we were only about 1,000 feet above the roofs of New York and were slowly sinking still nearer to them." Unquote. Wait, did I say these events were tragic and there was only a sole survivor? My mistake. Those were lies. I was lying. The incident wasn't actually tragic at all, just harrowing, technically speaking. Both Pearl and the balloonist in the carriage with her finally made it down safely. And yes, that quote I just gave was, of course, from Pearl herself. Pearl White, the heroine of 1,000 Stunts. She survived to tell the tale. Not only was the first chapter in the Perils of Pauline saga successfully shot, but the whole series was a hit and had 20 chapters in total. White even went on to star in various other popular adventure serials throughout the 1910s, often performing her own stunts, up to and including other aerial feats. Wrong one. Sorry. That's annoying. Okay. All right. Riding in a little basket under a giant unsteerable balloon sure seems dangerous. One is moved about entirely at the whim of the winds. I'd imagine this was especially the case over 100 years ago when they didn't have so many pesky flight regulations to, protect people from dying and whatnot. But how dangerous is it nowadays? Well, there are certainly ballooning accidents, even in modern times, and these do result in the passengers tragically losing their lives, in fact. In January of this year, 4 people died and 1 person was injured in a ballooning accident in Elroy, Arizona. The National Transportation Safety Bureau, or NTSB, who you may know as the same bureau who investigates the causes of tragic airplane crashes and uncanny airplane disappearances, also investigates ballooning accidents. According to their investigation, this accident was caused by an issue with the balloon's envelope. In February, in the country of Georgia, 2 balloonists and a TV operator died after their aerostat collided with power lines. Colliding with power lines, as we'll soon see, is a hazardous running theme with balloons. According to a study of ballooning accidents between 1964 and 1995, there were nearly 500 such accidents on record, involving over 1,500 people. These resulted in 92 deaths and 384 injuries. According to NBC News, the NTSB reported 16 deaths caused by ballooning accidents between 2002 and 2012. This is really low compared to many other types of deaths, like, for example, car accidents, heart attacks, or, say, war and genocide. And while there was a slight increase in balloon accidents in the last few decades, this may change. In 2016, a balloon pilot caused the deaths of 16 people in a single accident after crashing into power lines near Lockhart, Texas. 16 people, the same total number of people who died by similar causes between the years of 2002 and 2012. Now, when the NTSB investigated the crash, they found that the pilot failed to cancel the flight due to low clouds and fog, even while other pilots in the area did cancel their flights. He continued the flight through clouds and fog, and then he attempted to land the balloon near clouds where it was hard to see the landing site. What's more is that the pilot had also taken drugs before the flight. According to USA Today, he had taken so much Benadryl that his blood alcohol level was the same as a drunken driver. He had also taken dextromethorphan, a cough suppressant found in over-the-counter drugs like Robitussin. The NTSB also found that the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, had failed to discover the pilot had a history of drug and alcohol convictions. As a result, In 2022, the FAA adopted new rules that require hot air balloon pilots to carry a medical certificate and pass a medical exam. In March, a hot air balloon hit power lines near a highway in Rochester, Minnesota. While the balloon flew off and drifted for a few miles, the basket tumbled to the ground with 3 people inside. Fortunately, nobody was seriously hurt. A similar accident took place in May 2019 in the Napa Valley. The balloon clipped a power line in Yountville, and 3 of the 19 passengers aboard sustained electrical burns. One passenger had to be flown to the hospital. The balloon was operated by Balloons Above the Valley, a company that has been investigated by the NTSB for this and other incidents with their hot air balloons. Later that month, a balloon operated by Wine Country Balloons in Santa Rosa took off from Sonoma County with a planned landing in Napa County, but was carried by unpredictable winds into the Mayacamas Mountains, where it landed hard, again injuring 3 passengers. Here is a video of a similar accident that happened in Southern California in 2022. Hot air balloons are big business in sunny California, with the highest numbers of balloon rides in the country. As I reported last November in Ufo episode 4, Stephanie Quick, an occultist with mysterious ties to UFOs and a resident of Napa Valley, complained of hot air balloons regularly flying extremely low over her neighborhood. But this problem has never actually been resolved, and she continues to decry these low flyers as a nemesis from the skies. They were sent by the Greys. What the hell? Oh. I'm sorry. Technical difficulties. Whether they were sent by the Greys or they hail from Magonia, these balloons are a menace. They cannot be controlled by their pilot, but are ultimately controlled by the wind. And in the Napa Valley, winds are unpredictable, so balloons require chase crews of people who follow them on the ground to try their best to ensure a safe landing. But ultimately, where a balloon goes and what it does is only up to the weather. Any serious injury is a serious injury, and no death of a person can ever be taken lightly, even if it's just one person, even if they're a jerk. Some balloon pilots and even whole companies can be reckless and should be monitored and regulated. But at the end of the day, compared to threats like cars, wars, and geopolitical conflicts, hot air balloons just aren't that dangerous. I don't mean to write off what Stephanie proclaims while shaking her fist at the heavens. I'm sure if I was in her dapper shoes, I'd do exactly the same thing. However, we must consider the balloon threat in reasonable proportion. All told, there are far more worrisome things in this world than hot air balloons, and most people who fly in them just have a good time. So, what's the big deal, you ask? Or maybe you don't ask that. I don't know. It's just what I'm imagining. In any case, believe it or not, it's not the balloons who carry it's the balloons that carry no passengers beyond perhaps hitchhiking bugs who are a few. Excuse me, I'm just going to start over there. Okay. Well, believe it or not, it's the balloons who carry no passengers, well beyond perhaps hitchhiking bugs, who are a far greater threat. Be they little balloons released by children or giant ones released by meteorologists, be they sky lanterns with small fires inside or just balloons full of helium, they are a threat. There is no pilot checking the weather, no crews on the ground tracking their progress and trying to ensure a safe landing, so they can wind up doing all sorts of things, seemingly all on their own accord. As I discussed in the first part of this series in in Ufos number 12, it's these sorts of balloons who are also most likely to be spotted as a UFO, like quite possibly in the Amaranth UFO close encounter case I mentioned, or the infamous Middle East object that I discussed. A number of high-altitude balloons have led to mass sightings of alleged UFOs. The first alleged UFO sighting by British ufologist Timothy Good was a part of a mass sighting of a flying pyramid that first hovered over Hertfordshire and then drifted over Greater London in England. 2 jets were sent to investigate, one from the RAF US Air Force Joint Air Base at Bentwaters and one from the de Havilland Aircraft Company. Neither was able to reach the object due to its extremely high altitude. While Good rejected the explanation that this object was a balloon because other similar objects sighted in the 1960s failed to be identified. I'm inclined to say, what? Why? What do you have against more likely explanations? As UFO debunker Philip Klass argued, meteorological balloons sent up by the French space program in that period could remain relatively stationary for days at high altitudes. Balloons were also the culprit again in 2 other mass sighting cases from central Chile and a month later over Buenos Aires, Argentina, during a wave of UFO sighting reports across large portions of South America in 1985. According to an in-depth study of these events by Luis Eduardo Pacheco, these sightings were caused by special high-altitude weather balloons called Montgolfier infrared or mirror balloons, again launched by the French space program. But high-altitude balloon sightings can also carry with them their own special hazards. In another case from September 5, 1968, thousands of people reported witnessing a flying pyramid over Madrid, Spain, which resulted in a huge traffic jam. An F-104 jet was scrambled to intercept the object, but similar to the case in England, when the jet flew to over 50,000 feet, it had to return for refueling. And again, this later turned out to be a French meteorological balloon. About 15 sequential hat tips in a row to Jeff Knox for the research he did on these various cases, as well as Luis Pacheco. But so what? Mistaking a balloon for a UFO is not in itself a threat, right? Even if it causes a traffic jam. True, but it can be pretty dangerous if you're a pilot, I suppose. In 1948, two separate cases of pilots chasing alleged UFOs were also likely caused by weather balloons. The first of these cases, in January of 1948, involved an ice cream cone, or parachute-shaped object, floating over Fort Knox, Kentucky. 4 P-51 Mustang fighter planes were dispatched to check out the object, pursuing it to 22,000 feet. The planes were not equipped with oxygen masks. So, while 3 of the Mustangs stayed behind, flight leader Thomas Mantell continued pursuing the object on his own. Then, eventually, like a modern Icarus, he flew too high and died due to lack of oxygen. This case was later explained by, as local monkey man Joseph Matheny put it, quote, "Ahem, skyhook. Thank you. Good night." Unquote. During this period, the US military started using high-altitude balloons both for scientific research and to gather reconnaissance over the Soviet Union. As I talked about in the first part in this series, the US Army Air Corps was using instruments attached to balloon trains to see if the Soviet Union was testing nuclear weapons. At the same time, the Office of Naval Research was using massive high-altitude balloons that were developed by General Mills. These skyhook balloons would inflate into giant orbs in the upper atmosphere, but at lower altitudes, the air inside the balloons would gather at the top of their envelopes, while towards the bottom, the balloon envelope would taper into a vacuum. So at different altitudes, these balloons would resemble a parachute or even a giant ice cream cone in shape. In all likelihood, Mantell died in his pursuit of a balloon. In another case, in October of 1948, pilot George F. Gorman saw a small blinking object while flying at night near Fargo, North Dakota. He attempted to chase it. He said that the object would rapidly shoot away from him at times, and at other times shoot towards him so fast he had to dive to avoid it. However, it may be that Gorman's own perception tricked him into thinking what he saw was a UFO making sudden maneuvers, when in reality he was experiencing various parallax effects. This is when the size and distance of an object are misinterpreted. If an object is thought to be far closer or farther than it actually is from an aircraft, then it may appear to pace a pilot or even move rapidly towards or away from them, when in reality it's moving slowly or not moving at all. And the distances and positions of objects in the sky can easily be misinterpreted. See, for example, the Lunar Terror case from Poland, which we discussed last week. These types of illusions are not only common, but they can potentially explain many alleged dogfights between aircraft and UFOs. Gorman could have easily witnessed a small weather balloon with a blinking light attached to it. But Unlike Mantell, Gorman did not die. So while a balloon can pose a real danger to a pilot just by being there in the sky, death by chasing or engaging with a balloon is, in all likelihood, an extremely rare event, much rarer indeed than the already rare death by hot air balloon accident. But people don't even have to do anything for balloons to pose a real danger. Oh no, they are in fact far more dangerous than any Cash Landrum diamond. In all truth, they are far more menacing than any vampire saucers that use energy beams to suck the blood of their victims in Para. Indeed, these phantoms of the sky will not be stopped by any military operation, and no weapon or army on Earth is even remotely equipped to stop them. Oh no, my friends. All a person has to do is let go of the balloon. Then it can do all damage all on its own. Not only do such terrors from the sky commonly disrupt electronic equipment and create massive physical traces on the ground from their horrific smoldering damage. Not only do such objects create eerie lights in the sky and large-scale devastation, even killing animals in massive numbers all at once. Oh, and they do. But a balloon can travel to any destination. It may become a transmedium object. It may even shapeshift into a mothership of sorts and let loose countless smaller flying objects. Even invisible flying objects. Indeed, a person doesn't have to do anything at all with the balloon, but to make it in a factory somewhere. A balloon can just be manufactured and not even be inflated with air. And even still, as though using uncanny powers of time travel, its fate is one of destruction, either in the here and now or in the far, far future. Yes, a balloon may still travel, propagate smaller versions of itself, and force its death and destruction upon the world through subtle and uncanny acts without even being inflated. Far in the future, long after you hear these words, long after the term UAP disclosure has not only lost all pretense of meaning, but has been completely forgotten by the survivors of any dystopian revelation. Balloons, who have never been bought or sold, may travel through the substrates of our physical reality and bring their punishments to bear upon humanity and life in general. Whether you like it or not, humans may go extinct entirely, and yet still balloons will be there, wreaking havoc with only the hands of the earth itself to guide them. And yes, I can prove this. This is not some poppycock cribbed from the pages of some crappy paperback written by Donald Kehoe, spewed from the mouth of some false whistleblower. Indeed, there is no defense initiative or secret counterintelligence operation who even cares about this issue, let alone is even remotely equipped to deal with it. Words and memes may break my brain, but balloons, they are each and every one objective objects. And all of these bombastic claims that I have made are facts, which can be demonstrated. One doesn't need FOIA requests to figure that out, though granted, they would likely be useful in uncovering some military secret or nefarious plot involving balloons. But be that as it may, the balloon threat as a whole is a purloined envelope, a dystopian secret that is right there, in plain sight. And balloons, they are just the tip of the iceberg. As dangerous as they are just the portent in the sky, a sign of things that are so much, much worse. It's in our skies, it's in our waters, it's in our very earth. Like some golem sent to help us, the threat of balloons has gone completely out of control, wreaking havoc and destruction everywhere they go. A threat and an expansively difficult challenge. But how? How can balloons conceivably do all of these fantastical and catastrophic things? How can balloons be so much like highly strange UFOs and yet also be so vastly more terrifying? What does a man called A.P. Strange have anything to do with this? Is there some tempestuous Tempestarius who is summoning these orbs from the clown realm and controlling them by controlling the very tempestuous weather itself? And how can I possibly prove any of this at all? Well, I am sorry to inflict this suspense upon you again, but like Pauline, we once again find ourselves hanging from a perilous cliff. This is where the balloon drops us, to find out the very worst threats, real documented threats that balloons have to offer. You'll have to wait. But please stay tuned for the third and final chapter of Balloons, a Flying Menace. And now for Luis Tayacano. Excuse me. And now for Luis Cayetano.
Thank you. So there is a, actually did add, Rachel, another slide for the actual paper. I hope you can see that on the next slide. Oh no, maybe it wasn't refreshed. Doesn't matter. But this is a very interesting paper. This is just a summary on Science Daily, but the actual paper is published in American Institute of Physics. Interestingly, the authors are from a Chinese university. And I say interestingly because China is one of the world's main purveyors of disinformation and misinformation, but we'll get to that. Now, so this is about modeling the spread of misinformation like a nuclear reaction. So most people are familiar with fission, where neutrons are emitted and then they cause a chain reaction where atomic nuclei are split, and then those nuclei emit further neutrons, etc. So it's like a chain reaction. But these researchers are thinking about a similar sort of thing, but how false information and rumors spread, okay? And they note that, of course, in today's internet environment and social media, it's very easy for a malicious actor to spread misinformation. I should mention misinformation and disinformation are not synonymous. Misinformation is when you've got false information, something which might not be, maliciously constructed, but it's just not true. That can spread. But disinformation is when a malicious actor knowingly spreads something to cause, division or confuse people or some other purpose like that. Yeah, so, sorry, let me let me just basically read what they say. So this was published in AIP Advances. The authors are from Shandong Normal University in Shandong Province, China. And their model can provide fresh insights on how online disinformation spreads and how to combat it. Mathematical models can stimulate or simulate how rumors spread and inform approaches to counter them. Commonly, they're adapted from epidemic models, where rumors stand in for microbes, as they are similarly contagious. While broadly useful, existing models fall short of capturing the complete picture of spreading misinformation. Infectious disease models may mostly view the spread of rumors as a passive process of receiving infection, thus ignoring the behavioral and physiological changes of people in the real world, as well as the impact of external events on the spread of rumors, said author Wenrong Zheng. In contrast, the team identified similarities between rumor spreading and fission, the reaction that occurs inside nuclear reactors. In their model, rumors act like neutrons, and these rumors are seen by individuals who send them careening into other people in a chain reaction. When individuals encounter rumors, they are influenced by their personal interests and decide whether to spread or whether repeated exposure is needed before spreading. So, in other words, some people just spread stuff without thinking because it seems to align with their personal interests or beliefs, and they don't really invest any effort into spreading that or like retweeting it if we're thinking about Twitter. But some people are more discerning. Even if they see something which is seemingly aligning with their beliefs, they might not spread that idea because it might not be real, or it might not be true, and they haven't looked into it, so they are a little bit more discerning. So based on different considerations of uranium fission thresholds, individuals are divided into groups based on the influence of their own interest thresholds, fully considering individual behavior and differences, which is more in line with the reality. So this new perspective on rumor propagation can offer insights into how rumors tend to spread and what individuals can do to mitigate them. The extent of rumor propagation is closely related to the proportion of rational internet users, said Zhang. This reflects the importance of education. The higher the level of education, the easier it is to question rumors when receiving information that is difficult to distinguish between right and wrong. As I sort of alluded to previously about some people are more discerning than others, that seems to probably correlate with education level. This approach can also help guide governments and media experts looking to counter misinformation. We have found that rumors propagate on a small scale at the initial stage, so official platforms need to carry out real-time monitoring. When the possibility of rumors is detected, the government or official media should check the contents of the rumors and make corrections so rational citizens can effectively inhibit the propagation of rumors. And if we're thinking about, again, interestingly that this is coming out of China, because not too long ago on Twitter, now called X, Elon Musk, in his infinite wisdom, actually dropped the Chinese and Russian government's obligation to, when they post something on one of their media outlets, they don't have to declare anymore that those are government affiliated outlets. And so people may get the impression that those are, legitimate sources of information or not biased. And so, I think that the original Twitter rules would be an example of something which could be self-corrective, or at least help to blunt the propagation of disinformation. Because if you can see where the information is coming from and who the affiliate is of that organization, then you might be more hesitant to retweet it or spread it yourself. But there are many things that governments can do. Now, of course, one government's disinformation may be another government's ideology or, policy or position. So, there are issues there as well. But still, I think these sorts of models are very useful. from a philosophical and empirical perspective, it's very fascinating to think that human interactions and human social processes can have dynamic similarities to natural phenomena. So this has been, thinking about things like punctuated equilibria. And something else that I saw recently was Alan Lichtman's 13 keys for predicting election outcomes in America. I can get into that in another episode, hopefully after the elections are over. Anyway, but he predicts that Kamala Harris is likely to be the next president if the GOP doesn't screw around with the, electoral officials and things like that. But again, there could be these processes in human society which are acting in a way which are in a way sort of abstracted away from the individuals, because we think of humans as almost unpredictable, but at scale, they seem to exhibit certain behaviors and dynamics which we can model. And it sort of reminds me of Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, where mathematicians could predict the outcomes in the long term, because there are trillions of people in the galaxy in that story, and sort of the individuals are smothered out by all the others, and so these large scale effects can be predicted. I find all that very interesting. Of course, there are probably limitations to that, because there are always stochastic factors when we're talking about anything as complex as a person or society, but I still think that there are certain aspects which can be modeled profitably. Any thoughts about that, Rachel and Jeff?
Not necessarily specifically, but as I mentioned before, the study of disinformation, misinformation, fake news, how that stuff spreads, why people believe it, is kind of like what my hobby is. What UFOs are to some people, that's like one of the things I study in my spare time. I don't study UFOs for fun, believe it or not. And there's actually there's a lot of good books, and you can actually get these for free from the SSRC, which is an organization. This one's Social Media and Democracy, and it's full of papers that relate to how social media and fake news and misinformation affects our democracy. And this is another one also by SSRC, The Disinformation Age, Politics, Technology, and Disruptive Communications in the United States. I mean, they talk about things like the Cox, how they use disinformation, all sorts of good papers in here. And this organization, SSRC, like I say, you can get these books in PDF online for free. I've got a few other ones as well that got lots of great papers on disinformation and how it affects our democracy and how people, manipulate people online to promote their agendas and stuff. Very worthwhile checking out.
And also this one, which has been in sort of, I think 17 editions or something, The Irony of Democracy by Dye and Ziegler. They talk about elite theory and the difference of that to pluralist theory. And again, thinking about these things that happen in society is almost, inevitably. You're always going to get elites forming in complex societies. They talk about that. That's very relevant, of course, to today's politics in America.
And SSRC is the Social Science Research Council. They do social and behavioral science research, and their website's just ssrc.org. And you can get those books and other books free in PDF online.
ssrc.org.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah, like I said, I've got a couple of other ones that I bought on Amazon because I like to read paper. Everybody knows I'm a paper guy. I don't like to read on the screen, so I bought physical copies of them, but they should be free. So, did you have anything to say, Rachel?
Not really. I'd have to review the paper more. I was too distracted doing stuff to be listening to your presentation. I'm sorry, Luis, I had to do production-y stuff behind the scenes.
The paper itself is pretty technical. It's got a bunch of equations and graphs, but
yeah, it sounds like it. I have the abstract open here. Well, I have the paper open here now. It sounds interesting for sure.
Yeah, I'll have to read the actual paper. I plan to read the actual paper. And I believe Louise posted that in the Discord, but yeah, so.
Me too, and I'll definitely be listening to your presentation on it later as well.
Yep.
All right, and now over to you, Jeff.
All right, cool. All right. First of all, I want to say thank you to Rachel for continuing to inform us about the balloon threat narrative, while some other people in this topic are trying to reframe balloons as extraterrestrial spaceships and talk about the UAP threat narrative. Rachel's bringing us the facts and the truth with the balloon threat. That's the real threat that we're suffering under. So, all right. So today, I am going to be talking about this case that happened in Biskopsberga, Sweden in 1808. And this is a case where there was some strange globules kind of moving in front of the sky that left this kind of iridescent kind of residue on the ground that some witnesses saw. But before we kind of get into the details of this case, just a little background on the kind of type of case this is. This is from William Corliss, and if you don't know who William Corliss is, he was kind of a cataloger of all sorts of anomalies that collected them in these various books. And this was in his book called Lightnings, Auroras, Nocturnal Lights, and Related Luminous Phenomenon. And he classified these type of cases as luminous aerial bubble cases, which he describes as large assemblages of colored spheres or bubbles drifting randomly, quietly, and almost playfully. Observers often compare them to toy balloons and soap bubbles. Their changing colors and iridescence strengthen the soap bubble analogy. These soft glowing spheres do not detonate destructively like ball lightning, but disappear silently like real soap bubbles. Hundreds of bubbles may fill the air during this phenomenon. And he goes on to kind of break this phenomenon into two other kind of distinct types. The first one is low-level objects that superficially resemble soap bubbles. And the second one are swarms of these higher altitude objects that appear to primarily move as points of light, but seem to drift with the wind in kind of a buoyant manner. And the kind of the first example that he gives is going to be the case that I'm talking about today. But again, he, in his kind of evaluation of these type of anomalies, he says, well, they're puzzling. These aerial bubbles are probably explainable without gross modifications of chemistry and physics, but we know so little about them that we can kind of only surmise this. So, and I think in these cases, it's probably a natural explanation, but they're just so intermittent that we don't really have an explanation. These cases are also sometimes referred to as solar bubble cases. And if you recall the case I spoke about in the last lecture by Wilhelm Schickard, that was also a case that has been referred to as a solar bubble kind of case. So before we get into the details of the case, a little background about a kind of our main character here, which, just like the last case with William Schickard, was a scientist that investigated this case. So Eric Acarius was a distinguished Swedish botanist. He was known as the father of lichenology for his pioneering work in the classification and study of lichens. He was born in Gävle, Sweden. He studied under the renowned botanist Carl Linnaeus at Uppsala University. And if you don't know who Carl Linnaeus is, he's the father of taxonomy. So how we break down different things into categories there. And I apologize if I mispronounce the Swedish names here. Believe it or not, I actually practiced them several times, but then kind of in the middle, I kind of think I end up messing them up here. So anyway, so Acarius developed this systematic approach for identifying and categorizing lichens, building on Linnaeus's previous work. He published several key works, including the Methodist Lichenium, and that he's published there in 1803. and the Lichenography Universalis, which significantly advanced the understanding of lichen diversity. His meticulous classifications laid the foundation for modern lichenology, and he described many new species earning recognition in the field. Acarius also served as a physician and held various academic positions throughout his career, contributing to the broader field of botany. His legacy continues to influence the study of lichens today, and named in his honor, they've created the Acarius Medal, which is an award that was established to recognize lifetime achievements in the field of lichenology. Recipients of the Acarius Medal are typically scientists who have made significant contributions to lichen research through their studies, publications, and advancements in taxonomy, ecology, or the conservation of lichens. Now, this medal here, I think this may be the original medal. So while this award wasn't actually created until like 1992, I believe, there was an original Acarius medal that was minted in the 1800s that they found in the Swedish mint. Now, I guess they don't really know why the medal was created in the first place, but they created this medal back in the 1800s, and they found it and created this award in the 1990s using the original, I guess, molds or whatever you make coins out of to recreate this new medal that they now give out to people for their accomplishments in lichenology. So Acarius essentially decided to put his use as a scientific investigator to use investigating an encounter that he had heard about. So in June 1808, after receiving various reports of a strange and likely unprecedented phenomenon observed near the village of Biskopsberga, he decided to visit the area himself to gather accurate and detailed information. He acknowledges that the initial accounts were inconsistent and were not directly from eyewitnesses, prompting him to do this in-person kind of investigation. Acarius believes this event was noteworthy and worthy of documentation for the Royal Academy, and so submits a report of his investigation that is published in the Transactions of the Swedish Academy of Sciences in 1808. This document would later be translated by J.C. Hauff for the North American Review in 1816, which is how most of us English speakers would eventually come to kind of find out about it. And in this document, he reports on this incident. So, on May 16, 1808, an unusual event occurred in the village of Biskopsberga near Skänninge in Östergötland, Sweden, on a hot, cloudless afternoon at roughly 4 p.m. Some workers of a local farm observed the sun dimming to a dark red, losing its usual brilliance. At the same time, countless dark brown spherical objects appeared from the western horizon, becoming darker as they neared the sun. In the western horizon, each about the size of a hat crown. And if you remember my last presentation about the German case, again, these objects were described as kind of hats or hat crowns kind of falling from the sky or moving in the sky. These balls traveled to the sky towards the east, becoming darker as they neared the sun and turning black when passing in front of it. Some of the spheres moved in formations before breaking apart and changing course, leaving behind wedge-shaped tails that gradually faded as they got further away from the sun. And again, in this illustration here, you can kind of see that as these objects are approaching the sun, they're in a spherical form. As you see them getting close to the sun, they appear to get a little bit darker here. And as they move away, they develop these tails before they eventually kind of fade away or become invisible. One of the eyewitnesses for this case was a K.G. Weathermark, a respected citizen who may or may not have been a secretary of the Royal Academy of Sciences in Sweden. So they referred to him as Secretary Weathermark. The records as to who was the kind of secretary of the Academy of Sciences are kind of incomplete. I guess a couple years before this, the guy that was the secretary of the Academy of Sciences had been dismissed for some reason. And so there was a few years where they had an interim, kind of like a deputy director. Unfortunately, those records were not really kept, so there's no actual list. But when researcher Martin Schau and Wim van Noordtrecht investigated this case, they do seem to believe there is evidence that this guy, Knut Gustav Westermark, was at least potentially a deputy director, could have been in charge of the Royal Academy of Sciences at this time period. But whether he was or not, he apparently was considered a respected citizen that people were to take credibly at the time. And he documented this event, and he noted as one of the spheres descended near him, it became invisible, but displayed a brilliant multi-kind of colored iridescent appearance, similar to a soap bubble. Upon landing, it left a brief, thin, transparent film resembling cobwebs on the ground. This entire spectacle lasted about 2 hours long. And during this time period, there was, as they said, up to millions of spheres that, crossed in front of the sun, supposedly. Now, afterwards, if we were to take Acarius' report at face value, that the witnesses consistently described the phenomenon, and as we can see here, he drew supposedly only on the reports of eyewitnesses that supposedly saw the phenomenon. But he does say that supposedly all the people in the village were also observing it as this was happening over this 2-hour period. Now, Biskopsberga is, it doesn't really, it's not an actual town or city anymore. It's really is part of Skåninge, but it was a small kind of more like a farming commune, almost off the main outside of the main town of Skåninge, and so it kind of still exists kind of as that. So if we were to take the reports as he describes them as accurate, that all these people did actually see the same thing as reported, it would suggest that there was a real physical phenomenon here, instead of some sort of like illusion. It wasn't, corpuscles in the eyes or, eye motes like causing, if it was only one person, then that was perhaps the case. But if we're to believe this whole village saw it and there was this physical evidence, there was obviously some kind of physical phenomenon that was going on. Now, some contemporaries have speculated that these balls were some sort of gelatinous substance carried by a whirlwind over the mountains or forests, which had somehow mixed with other chemicals in the air. However, questions remain about how such a large quantity could have been produced and how they managed to obscure the sun. Some other theories were perhaps there was like a soap factory that had started on fire, and that had released these kind of like bubbles into the air. And as crazy as that sounds, apparently there is some precedence for soap factories starting on fire during that time period. But another theory that some have suggested that have studied the case, they've suggested that the Swedish spheres, as these would come to be known, might have been some kind of volcanic dust or ash. This theory links the phenomenon to the eruption of the Ursulina volcano on the island of São Jorge in the Azores, Portugal. This eruption occurred on the morning of May 1st, 1808, and again, I guess later in June. The eruption devastated the parish of Ursulina and created this basaltic formation that is now known as the Ponte di Ursulina and left a trail of destruction in its wake. While the volume of spheres witnessed could certainly be explained by gases released during the volcano following days of intense seismic activity and eruptions, the puzzle does still remain about how the volcano could have formed these soapy bubbles as described by the witness Wettermark. Now, it was Charles Fort who actually brought this case to kind of wider attention in his 1919 book, Book of the Damned. And Charles Fort often speculated about kind of fantastical explanations for some of these cases, like space vampires. But in this case, he acknowledged that this particular story hinted at a more terrestrial and likely natural cause, even though he could not identify one. He warned against the inclination to assume that all related data points point to a single type of phenomenon, suggesting instead that the external world is infinitely varied. And he specifically said the tendency would have been to jump to the homogeneous conclusion that all our data in that expression related to this one kind of phenomenon, whereas we conceive of infinite heterogeneity of the external, of crusaders and rabbles and immigrants and tourists and dragons and things like gelatinous hat crowns, or that all things here upon this earth that flock together are not necessarily sheep, Presbyterians, gangsters, or porpoises. So, as Martin Schau, again, at Wim van Utrecht, state in the book Redemption of the Damned, which is a reanalysis of kind of the cases that were featured in Fort's book, kind of state. If an infinitely diverse reality can include the possibility of space vampires, and then might not it also be possible one of these more kind of mundane, prosaic kind of alternative explanations might be the solution? Now, none of these kind of explanations can fully align with the reports and all the details provided in Professor Curious's report there. Some might fit at least a very few aspects of it, and if perhaps some of those eyewitness accounts were not as firmly established or consistent as the Curious implies, we might possibly come up with some of these explanations might be valid in this case. Now, unfortunately, as with most old cases, nothing really can be determined conclusively. In this case, all we have is that original report in the Transactions of the Swedish Academy of Sciences. We don't really have any other documents from the time. We have his kind of secondhand story that, while he investigated personally, is still, we have his narrative version of the events. And so it's important to consider the possibility of specific local causes as well. Like I said, soap fire may seem kind of silly, but again, there was precedence for it. So we have to consider some of these local explanations, such as potentially volcanic ash in the sky. We know volcanic ash certainly does, just like fires, when there's big forest fires, all that ash in the sky can dim the sky, kind of red, reducing its brilliance. So you can actually look at it kind of during the day, much like these witnesses described. Now, we also must remember that this story is part of a larger pattern of similar accounts reported across the globe for centuries. What was a singular unknown event for Acarius and perhaps at his time, by the time Fort started kind of catalog and collect these events, many similar such accounts throughout history kind of had been recorded. And I shared this publication kind of last time, this Invasion of the Solar Bubbles catalog, also by Martin Schau, but by Chris Albach as well. And it's kind of a catalog of all these kind of solar bubble or luminous kind of like bubble cases that they've kind of like collected. So there's a history of these events, and the case I talked about last time could be considered one of these events, even though it didn't seem to leave any gelatinous kind of substance on the ground. Now, a couple of the cases that kind of were mentioned in Schau's book and elsewhere kind of in relation to this case were this case here. This first one, the supposedly true story behind the Blob. The Blob, of course, being the 1958 kind of horror movie. And this case happened on September 26th in 1950 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And at 10 p.m., policemen John Collins and Joseph Keenan are patrolling Vera Avenue near 26th Street in South Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, when they see something like a parachute drifting ahead of them at treetop level. It's about 6 feet in diameter and settles in an open field. After summoning Sergeant Joseph Cook and patrolman James Casper, they go into the field to investigate. When they turn their flashlights on, it gives off a purplish glow, almost a mist that looks as though it contained crystals. Collins touches it and it dissolves in his hand, leaving an odorless, sticky residue. It completely evaporates within 25 minutes. Now, as mentioned, this event inspired producer Jack H. Harris to ask his friend Irvin H. Milgate to come up with a story for what would eventually become the 1958 horror film The Blob. This movie, The Blob, actually starred a young Steve McQueen in what is either his first or one of his first kind of major roles in a feature film. And this movie would be remade again, I believe, in 1988 and again in 1995 with Tracy Lords, I think. So it's been remade a couple of times, but it's actually based on a real case that these Pennsylvania policemen saw in 1950. Another case is a case that happened this week in history, and it's a case of strange web-spinning flying cigar visits Ohio. And this is a case involving a school, kind of a mass kind of sighting at a school that shares some similarities to a case that happened on today's date, actually, in 1955 in North Carolina, another kind of mass sighting school angel hair event. But this event happened on October 22nd, 1954, in Jerome and Marysville, Ohio. And it happened at 3 p.m. Principal Rodney Warrick and teacher Mrs. George Dittmar at Jerome, Ohio Special School watch a large silver-colored object hanging motionless in the sky. Soon it takes off, and in its wake leaves a trail of a whitish web-like substance that floats down and begins to hang from the wires along the road. And you can see that it supposedly had 6 square windows. The cigar had 6 square windows as it moved. It descends, and both strands and balls for 45 minutes kind of fall on the ground. Both adults get greenish stains on their hands from it. All of it dissipates, but the substance placed in jars dissipates more slowly. Now, of course, in this case, like many angel hair cases, Blue Book kind of defined it as spider gossamer webs that had fallen on the town. And this sighting actually, it was more than just Jerome, Maryville, and Ohio. If I remember correctly, the webs kind of fell over kind of that whole kind of region, like Illinois, Ohio, and other areas. So they were not the only ones to get this kind of a spider or angel hair or whatever you want to call it, the substance that kind of fell to the ground. So, and this is just a chart. I was just kind of curious with these angel hair cases, how many of them kind of seem to come from these globes or sphere shapes. And according to this chart that was produced by angel hair researcher Brian Boldman, it says roughly 29% of cases in the 72 cases he looked at in this study, the angel hair seems to fall from some sort of globe or sphere-like object. This last case where it was kind of a cigar shape, I guess, seems to be a little bit more rare, only in about 14% of cases. Most angel hair cases seem to come from disc or saucers. Now, and in fact, today happens to be kind of, like I say, when 3 of the biggest kind of angel hair, most famous angel hair cases occurred. Today, on October 27th in 1952, we have the famous Galec-France case and the mass sighting in Florence, Italy, where supposedly 10,000 people at a football stadium game witnessed these 2 discs flying by, and it kind of dropped angel hair kind of on the crowd and area. And these are probably 2 of the more famous angel hair cases. And a couple years later, on today's date in 1955, we have again another case of supposedly hundreds of people at a school in Whitsett, North Carolina, that saw kind of an object and left angel hair that they kind of collected. So these angel hair cases are interesting. There's a lot of precedents for cases like these. There's back kind of in the Fort Times, in the Fortean days, they had what they called star jelly cases, where they would find kind of gelatinous substances on the ground that they would think would come from the stars. And not in every case is there actually kind of a sighting to go along with the substances found. But in some of these cases, there are. Is this the same phenomenon as was witnessed in 1808? Who knows? But it's interesting. Some of these cases, the substances come out to be spider webs, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they seem almost synthetic. So again, I don't think there's one answer for all these cases. So we shouldn't really try to necessarily bundle them all in the same bucket. We should approach each case individually. Okay, that's what I got for you guys today.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay. Tim Brigham in the chat said there appears to be more occurrences in the fall with regards to angel hair. It's interesting to note that the word gossamer, which is the word for the silk that ballooning spiders produce, that actually means goose summer. And it comes from, so it's an English word that originally meant goose summer, from the time that these flying ballooning spiders appear in the late summer. So around September, I think.
Let me see if I can share something real quick here. I pointed out before, a lot of these kind of angel hair cases seem to occur in October, and that does seem to be kind of what he finds in his little study here and this little chart. It's kind of low resolution, but you can see the vast majority of, in this study of 72 cases here, occurred during the month of October. I have noticed in my post there seems to be a little bit of a bump also early in the year. You get some kind of like April, May kind of angel hair cases, but the vast majority occur in October with some kind of leftover going into like November. So that seems to heavily kind of imply there's some sort of something going on in this time period that is responsible for these cases that isn't happening the rest of the year.
It's really interesting. Yeah, that was a wonderful presentation, Jeff. This is like some of my favorite stuff that I'd like to look at in UFOs is.
And for whatever reason, yeah, they seem to be bigger back then, 1955, 1953. Early 50s seemed to be a big year for angel hair. And then it died down. I wonder why that is.
Interesting. Yeah, it could be cultural factors, could be environmental factors.
Yeah.
Maybe it's some sort of technological, some sort of chemical byproduct or something released by aircraft or something like that.
Yeah.
In some of these cases.
And you can Brian Baldwin has 2 lectures you can find on YouTube. I've linked them on our Discord channel, but he gave a lecture on angel hair at the MUFON LA UPARS on their channel in 2005. And you can also find I believe a MUFON lecture of his on angel hair he gave, where he talks about many of these cases, like today's Whitsett, North Carolina case.
Cool. Okay, now moving on. We are going to continue a little bit our discussion about the Hill case from last time, because Martin Kottmeyer actually did a really thorough critique of our presentation. So I'm just going to go over that, and then we will move on to the next chapter in reliability. So he said, in response to something that I said, that Barney died of complications from an ulcer, which could have been due to stress. He says it was not known in the 60s, but ulcers are now realized as commonly caused by bacteria called Helicobacter pylori, not stress, and would be treated nowadays by a round of antibiotic treatments. So thank you. Yeah, I did not know that. So ulcers, while they can be worsened by stress, it looks like the science nowadays is saying really that it's this bacteria that's the main cause, and the treatment is to deal with the bacteria, basically. And then he talks about folie à deux. So this is in response to what Jeff was saying about folie à deux. Ultimately, such a condition is not necessary to explain this event.
And I agreed with that.
Yes, yeah, you do agree with that. I did not have a chance to look more. I want to talk more about folie à deux on this show sometime, because it's not something that I've actually really looked into a whole lot. But
I think what's his face, Martin Truzzi might mention something in that book where he's saying a dominant, the alien abduction by Terry Matheson. Oh no, I'm sorry, no, he's not in that book. The Encounters at Indian Head book, where modern research says you don't actually need a dominant personality for folie à deux to occur. So again, but either way, like I say, I don't think it's necessary to explain the situation.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessary either, but it's something that we'll have to explore another time. Of greater concern, the concept of screen memories is invoked to suggest that the Hills may have maybe suffered some sort of trauma on the return home from their visit to Canada. Alien trauma is actually just a screen member for something they experienced. Okay, so his first point is that traumas are no longer thought to be repressed or forgotten. And this is something that I was aware of, and I wish that I was more engaged during the show. It's really hard for me sometimes to be live on the show and also actively interacting with what people are saying. So yeah, traumas are not usually forgotten. And in fact, they tend to be very insistent and difficult to emotionally process reality and get beyond it. So yeah, the Freudian idea of repression is pretty much rejected nowadays. It underpins the therapeutic reasoning of supporters of the Satanic Panic, and in ufology was used by Hopkins and Jacobs, who, of course, were not had no expertise in psychology, to insert abduction scenarios into otherwise innocuous events. He suggests this book by Frederick Crews, Follies of the Wise, dissenting essays, that really deconstructs this concept. And now Jeff and I were talking about the Satanic Panic and how this might not be the underpinning of Satanic Panic, but that's something that I have to do more research into. But our understanding is that a lot of the memories that people reported from the Satanic Panic were not recovered, but were really more elicited through guided questioning, or through what is the word that I'm looking for? Leading questions. But yeah, the idea of screen memories is pretty much pseudoscience.
So what would be the Hopkins tie-in there exactly? Because my idea was that the aliens were supposedly erasing the abduction experience. So what would be the screen there, so to speak?
I don't know enough about Hopkins, to be honest. Jeff, you could probably answer that much better than I can, I'm guessing.
Well, I mean, just the implication was, and again, I was just repeating something, an opinion shared by one of these other authors, not my personal opinion per se, but what they were implying was that the whole experience, so in some cases, like when people are abducted, they believe they have these alleged screen memories of owls or deers, and that's a cover for whatever traumatic alien abduction experience they have. The idea was, well, if they can create some sort of cover memory for a traumatic alien abduction experience, maybe the alien abduction experience is a cover for some real trauma that occurred that had nothing to do with aliens, like they had a traumatic encounter with someone, and so this alien experience was the screen memory of sorts. It was the false memory that's covering up some sort of hidden trauma. I think so. This is kind of referring to some I was saying. I just kind of want to be clear. One thing is, I think this seems a little kind of backwards to me. His reasoning that this is kind of what supported the Satanic Panic in ufology. I think it's literally the opposite that's true. It was this idea that memories are accurate, that traumas are recalled accurately and truthfully, that led to things like the Satanic Panic and people believing false, bogus memories as being real.
Yeah, and I think I kind of agree with you, but again, I don't claim to be an expert on Satanic Panic, so he might be sort of right. And the other thing to mention is that Satanic Panic is not even really that relevant to his criticisms. He also says, even some who haven't completely abandoned the idea admit screen memories have fallen into disfavor as an antiquated and dusty concept, because right? Screen memory is basically a false memory used to repress a real traumatic memory. And again, there's no reason to suggest that people repress memories, that this idea of Freudian repression of trauma is very outdated. So there isn't really a basis for screen memories at all, basically. So the idea that, the Hills would have suffered some sort of real trauma by being attacked by, someone on the road or something like that, they would have much more likely have actually remembered that and reported it accurately than to have repressed it and turned it into, a fantastic encounter with a UFO.
Yeah, I think this might be, again, a bit of just a semantic issue using a ufological term like screen memories. I mean, I just mean to imply that it's absolutely a fact that people create false memories about real traumas. Like, this is not a Freudian thing, it's neurobiology. Like, this is what false memories are, a real legit thing that affect a lot of people. And many times they do cover real trauma as well. So, I mean, again, I don't think breaking it down to just Freud, or I don't think it's even about repression. I'm not saying they repressed anything, but you can absolutely forget things and replace them with bogus memories. You're not necessarily repressing the memory, but you're replacing them with false memories. And I think this is kind of well established in research.
I mean, it's true that memories get distorted and can become so distorted over time that they basically get replaced with other memories that are entirely different. Elizabeth Loftus demonstrates that, but with such a profound traumatic memory like that, I don't think that being attacked on the side of the road or something would get replaced by a completely different experience. I don't know. I don't see that as very. It
Well, it
seems like
wouldn't have to be being replaced with a completely different experience, right? They had a real UFO sighting. They had this real, whatever they did along the road, like a lot of that's real. All you'd have to do is change certain aspects of it, like distorting your original memory. So again, it's not, I don't think, I wasn't meaning by there's some completely fake screen memory. I think it's just a distorted memory in this case.
I mean, maybe it seems like a bit of a stretch to me, but
there's also the issue of screen memory is more specific, whereas a replacement is a more general category, right? So there could be replacement or distortion over time, but it doesn't mean that the function of that is to screen the memory. It could just be in keeping with the fact that memory is faulty and does change, not only in traumatic cases, but also non-traumatic cases.
Yeah. I also just want to point out, he mentions here that if they had real trauma with hoodlums, shouldn't have been bruising and injuries. And he was in the military and shouldn't his hands up. I think this kind of, it's a false idea to think that only physical trauma and encounters would be traumatic. We know Barney was a highly paranoid, anxious guy that basically was traumatized by the most inane, mundane things, like people he encountered on the street. So I don't think it had to be a physical, like a fight or I don't think there necessarily was a physical encounter that happened. But, I could easily see how he could be psychologically traumatized because he has a long history of being psychologically traumatized.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that, like Hotmeyer is saying, traumatic memories or traumatic experiences are very, very impactful on the brain. So I know that you've said in the past that these traumatic memories can get distorted, but I guess I'm going to just have to do more research. I wish
I think
Martin
the idea
Hotmeyer
that
was here because I'd be really curious to see how he responds to your comments. So let's move on to the next slide here. The next thing that he says is Betty Hill. She's so fantasy prone, and it's really convenient. He made a transcript and was using the transcript. I went back and figured out how to make transcripts out of our videos, which is very helpful. I think this is Jeff. She's so fantasy prone and so easy to accept something's UFO sighting would show we believe the abduction case, but a lot of the people that do believe the abduction are easy to dismiss her later credulity as that she was kind of, I don't know what, that's kind of difficult to follow, but so fantasy proneness is an inappropriate label for Betty Hill. It is not synonymous with credulity. As a psychological syndrome, it was defined in Theodore X. Barber and Cheryl C. Wilson's 1983 paper, The Fantasy-Prone Personality: Implications for Understanding Imagery, Hypnosis, and Parapsychological Phenomena, which this is like a really important study and kind of defined fantasy proneness. Fantasy prone people are full. I haven't read this in a really long time, so I'm glad that he brought this up. Fantasy prone people are fully aware that they live their lives in fantasy. So, in Wilson and Barber, the best indicator of fantasy proneness is to ask what % of the time they spend in fantasy. The psychological definition of fantasy proneness is then based on this this diagnosis. So the fantasy prone person is not someone who carries false beliefs about the world and has false delusional experiences, but rather they have these dissociations into fantasy that they are fully aware are fantasy. And that's a really important distinction. An answer of 50% or more gets you a fantasy prone subject 96% of the time. Joe Nichols' use of label is scandalously inept. And his papers arguing abductees are fantasy prone are blatantly flawed. He ignores that his indicators apply to far larger segments of the population than the 4% suggested by Barber and Wilson, and he does not provide a method to focus onto the people it legitimately applies to. I think that's a really, really good criticism. This idea was strongly called into question in Kenneth Ring's Omega Project, which I actually have that book, which I bought, mistaking it for the beta project at the time, and I still need to read it. Kenneth Ring's Omega Project study failed to find a significant level of fantasy proneness in his sample of subjects. Bartholomew and Basterfield expressed some misgivings about Ring's not bringing a full battery of tests to bear. Ring countered that Barber and Wilson's study was a hodgepodge in certain ways, and that where it strays into mystical experiences and paranormal phenomena, it is not really measuring directly fantasy proneness. Whether or not convinced Basterfield or Bartholomew, the statement was a sound warning. So this is a pretty messy topic. A later study by Rodiger and Goodplaster and Blatterbauer using Wilson and Barber's ICMI instrument more satisfactorily settled the issue. Their sample showed no significant deviation of their sample from the population average overall, and only 2 of their 27 abductee subjects showed high scores. 2 subjects out of 27 had high scores. Basterfield delivered a paper at the 1992 MIT symposium on abductions that accepted that the fantasy proneness hypothesis of abductions had not lived up to its initial promise and applied to only some individual cases rather than the totality of the phenomenon. So, in other words, overall, alien abduction experiences are not connected to fantasy proneness, but in a small minority of cases, there is a connection. This concession was hardly an obscure development and has been cited and discussed by several ufologists. Betty Hill was mistaken about a lot of things, but that is not proof she would have answered the question of how much time she spent in fantasy as over 50%. which is a good point. Like Betty would, I feel like Betty, from my experience, it seems like she tends to believe things, or that she'll make claims that, and she doesn't tend to be like, oh well, I had a fantasy of this happening, or I imagined this happening, but she tends to say instead things like, this happened and this definitely happened, kind of thing.
So she was delusional.
So,
Maybe a better term, credulous, but she wasn't consciously aware that she was seeing things which are not there, or that she was distorting things. But we were not using the correct. I mean, it's true when one of us was talking about fantasy proneness, we weren't using the clinical definition, but I think our intention was just to draw attention to the fact that she was fantasy prone, but she wouldn't have identified that as those fantasies as such.
Yeah, well, she's not fantasy prone according to Wilson and Barber's criteria. But I think that there's something going on with Betty, something else, and I'm not even sure if delusionals, delusion, fantasy proneness, these terms can get really, really difficult and messy really quickly, I found. And I mean, they're very controversial even today.
So so again, I just want to say, hey, I think he's absolutely right for pointing out the incorrect use of a clinical term. But again, I think like what Louise is saying, and like kind of what I was saying, and I think what Joe Nickel and most people are saying, is that they're not using it per se in the correct clinical definition of the term. Perhaps the more accurate way to say it would have been, she was credulously prone to misidentifications and fantastical explanations. I was using it more in a literal sense, as in she's prone to fantastical explanations for things, not that she lives in a fantasy world 50% of the time. And I think that's what most people, when they're saying these people are fantasy prone, are meaning a more kind of like general English language direct meaning, is that they're prone to fantasy, like they're prone to fantastical explanations. We weren't saying she was fantasy prone in a clinical definition of the term. And so that's my bad for perhaps using a clinical term instead of a more generic term, like she's just credulous.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is that
fantasy prone.
I like that you give that description of her, of you get. I don't remember exactly the wording that you used, but you used a much more elaborate and particular description of what Betty was doing just now, about being credulous and that kind of thing. The problem is that, right, we're trying to come up with an explanation for what happened, and when we're talking about what happened phenomenologically, what happened in a person's mind, then we have to be really, really specific and use, and be like, we have to use very specific language, because otherwise, like, you could be saying something that is psychologically inaccurate. So the psychologist is approaching this from a perspective of, oh, well, we can actually study the mind empirically, just like anything else in the world. And so in order to understand alien abduction experiences from a psychological perspective, then we have to be able to find clear correlations and clear causes and effects. And if you use the wrong language, then that can really keep you from being able to explain those causes and effects, but it can also keep you from actually understanding them in the first place.
You can say prone to fantasy, but not fantasy prone. Two different things, psychologically speaking, even though they're identical linguistically.
But is there a name for it? Prone to fantasy? Is there a formal, psychological condition or anything like that?
I think that fantasy proneness and being prone to fantasy are the same thing. I'm not sure what you're saying there, Jeff.
Well, there's somebody prone to fantasy.
You're
Jeff,
saying fantasy proneness supposedly means you're delusional, and then you live in a fantasy world over 50% of the time. You can be prone to fantasy without living in a fantasy world at all.
Well, I mean, fantasy proneness is also something that exists on a continuum and is measurable in that way. So,
Is it?
like, yeah, it's not like a black and white thing where you're either fantasy prone or you're not fantasy prone, but
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah.
but it's a range. And for someone to be prone to fantasy, we're still defining the terms fantasy and prone in the same way. I mean, unless you want to give a separate definition for fantasy and prone when they're not used in that word order or something, then when you say that someone is prone to fantasy, they might not have like
Is
a
believing in
fantasy. They might not like. There's also the other term, schizotypy, and which is similar, but not the same. Where a person can have, there's actually a schizotypal disorder, which is kind of like a disorder that's related a little bit to schizophrenia, but it's different. But there's also just a measure of schizotypy. So a person's personality can be more or less schizotypal, meaning like having certain features of schizophrenia.
What
And
about
so
what?
to me, it sounds like there is no psychological reason to be saying that someone who is prone to fantasy is fundamentally different from someone who is fantasy prone, because just changing the word order doesn't change the meaning of those words.
which is kind of my point. Like, if you're prone to believing in fantastical explanations, how is that not being prone to fantasy?
Well, because
Semantically,
fantasy
it's the
here,
same thing. The difference here is between a clinical definition and just a normal definition by the terms. By the terms, what we said works, but that's not apparently the clinical definition. And I don't think anyone, I've read these Rodiger and Baskerville papers before in the past. I don't think anyone's claiming that abductees live in a fantasy world 50% of the time or more. I think most people are just using it in a more generic sense, is that they're more prone to accept a fantastical explanation for something than they are. Because, yes, of course, they found that there is no people that report abductions are not on the fantasy prone clinical definition, are not more likely to be that. That can absolutely be the case in certain circumstances, but as an overall explanation, it's not valid. And I don't
no, yeah, see, so my criticism of what you're saying is that you're using two different definitions of the term fantasy, and that really just confuses the issue. It makes it really much more difficult to understand what's going on or to explain what's going on if you use two different definitions of fantasy, because on one hand you're saying fantasy means something that you engage in that you're aware is not real, and on the other hand you are kind of using a version of the term fantasy that is closer to delusion. And I think really it makes a lot more sense. It makes a lot more sense to just use, the term fantasy when we're trying to come up with a psychological or phenomenological explanation for something, to just use the word in one way, because otherwise it's confusing.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree, Rachel, that we should be as precise as possible, and if we can avoid using a term which has already got a clinical definition, we should use something different. But then could we say like schizophrenic or schizotypy, or could we say like what would be the clinical category for somebody who's extremely lacking in discernment? Like they see something which is like a little bit unusual, but then they just sort of blow it out of proportion. But it doesn't mean that they see things all the time. It's just like when they do see those lights or whatever that look a little bit strange, because she was purported to be like always reporting UFOs, even from like lamp lights and things like that. But I'm just thinking like something which somebody just sort of blows things out of proportion. What's the term for that?
Someone prone to jump into fantastical explanations for things.
I wouldn't say fantastical, but
I mean, they are fantastical though.
I think that there's probably,
it's fantastic.
I think one similar term to that is confabulation, or confabulatory or something like that, which is a tendency to distort memories, and blow them out of proportion and stuff like that very easily without
That's more your recollection of a memory or how you narrate something as opposed to how you interpret the results of an event.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing is that I mean,
Fabulous,
unless
yeah.
fabulous, yeah, and that's the thing is that as you're having an experience, you're not usually reporting the direct experience.
But can we
So
say fantasist if it's not a fantasy? Again, like,
yeah, I think a fabulist and a fantasist are two very different things.
are they?
Yes.
I don't know.
In the context of our discussion, yes.
I mean, to be fair, even things like the word delusion are not per se technically defined and have fluid meanings in the psychological world. Some people define delusion as a belief that's actually harmful, but other people say some delusions are not actually harmful. Like you can have delusions that aren't harmful to you. So again, like there's like debates on these terms still to this date, like as to what means what, and it's constantly changing. So
Yeah, and this is something that we've talked about before, and that's the thing is that these are very, very hairy, and it's really important. And I've said this a number of times in the past in the context of other fields, right? And in terms of like anthropology and the study of religion, you know, I previously did a piece where that was one of the main points that I made was that, you know, like you can't just talk about religion. You have to talk about a specific thing using specific terms, and you have to define those terms because the term religion is really, really a very vague term that can mean a lot of different things. And it's the same in this kind of context. Like if you're going to use a term like fantasy or delusion in a context where you're trying to understand the psychology of an experience, then it's really important to define those terms and to only use those terms in one particular way, because otherwise it's, you know, it's, you're not going to be able to come up with a coherent explanation.
I think you also have to speak to your audience. Like, you know, if you're speaking to a clinical psychologist, yeah, you should definitely be using absolute terms. But if you're speaking to a lay person that doesn't know what these things mean, it's perhaps more okay to use generic sounding words that.
But maybe not, because then they're going to perpetuate those words in their own discussions. And I think we should still try to, you know, delineate some of these things, even to a general audience. I think it's just useful. Good rule of thumb.
I would, yeah, I absolutely agree. Like if you were trying to teach someone chemistry, right, you wouldn't like start using outdated chemical terms. Like you wouldn't be talking about you wouldn't be talking about the 4 elements or something like that. You know, you would only really try to describe chemical elements in a precise and accurate way, because otherwise you would not be communicating chemistry in a coherent way. Okay. So Junior, this is the last point, was, I think Amy brought this up in the chat or something. My understanding is that Junior was the name given to the bust of the aliens that Betty carried around with her to speeches and UFO events. It's supposed to be based on drawings made by David Baker, so maybe the alien in the sketch was also called it, but Betty said school children gave the name Junior to the bust. So I don't really know. Yeah, and it sounds like he doesn't know for sure, but that the documentation makes it sound like it's probably that the bust was called Junior.
Yeah, I was just trying to remember which image in the chapter I was thinking of, and I was, you know, thinking of, he's right. It's the bust is what they called it based on the drawing. So yeah, that's Junior's the bust.
The quantum ether. All right. Are we ready for the?
Oh, by the way, wasn't there another slide, Rachel, about the lost time issue? They think it's actually not correct. Like it's sort of a comedy of errors, as they said.
Oh, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
the
Did I
missing
skip
time.
over a
Mhm.
point? Okay. Hold on a
Well,
second.
it's just links, basically. He gives links to James McDonald's solution for
Oh,
the missing time.
yeah. And I had asked you guys to read that, and then I did not actually read it. So, did someone read that?
No, I couldn't. No, I
I
couldn't
mean,
get to it.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, we're gonna have to come back to that, but not like.
I
No.
did, but I'm going to pretend that I didn't.
I think what we should do is maybe like in a few months, just like do another episode that focuses a lot of time on the Hill case or something like that.
I'll just say I believe Rich pointed out in our last episode that it could have been the Cannon Mountain kind of light on Cannon Mountain. And that is, in fact, what these articles are kind of about, was that it was a light that they could have seen on Cannon Mountain. And
Yeah, I'm not sure why he links that there.
no,
Oh, he's saying because that's the. It's not. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know enough about Folia Dew. It's something that I'm going to have to do a lot more research on because I've never really learned about it. And it sounds like he doesn't really talk about it very much, though. Peter Brooksmith showed the math behind the missing time amnesia was false. Betty's dreams were dreams, and the regressions mostly rework the dreams. It is ultimately a comedy of errors and failures of logic. The mental confusion didn't rise to the level of needing psychiatric detention or medication, so psychiatric labels were neither required nor helpful. Okay, that makes sense. So folia due was not really necessary. It wasn't from a psychiatric standpoint. It wasn't really a necessary explanation. Because that's the other thing too, is that the reason that these terms exist isn't, for ufologists to explain UFO events, but it's really more for psychiatric purposes, for the treatment of mental conditions.
Anyways, back to the missing time. Too long didn't read version is essentially people like Tim Printy and others went and did this drive themselves. Sometimes even a couple times, like over the years. And if you recall, the Hills basically ended up coming home at a little after 5 p.m. And like when these guys recreated the drive, they like the Tim Printy and his one recreation basically got home a little after 5, got to where they were at a little after 5 a.m. So again, like there really was not any missing time on this drive. Like if you take into consideration that there's old curvy roads that you're not going 60 miles an hour on, like you're going very slowly on through these curvy mountain roads. Like Tim Printy drove the road 50 years plus later. And it's like even now where there's more lighting and everything's better, like it's a slow drive that takes time. And when you take in consideration the couple of stops that they've mentioned talking about that they stopped to try and see the light, like with the binoculars and whatnot, that more than explains the time they get home in the morning. So there never really was any missing time in the first place. And in this case, that isn't just explained by the duration of the drive. That's the too long didn't read version of those things.
Cool. All right. Did you guys read this Robert Young chapter?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Yeah.
good. Okay. All right. Go ahead, Luis. I'll pass it over to you.
Okay. I got the impression you were going to lead this, Rachel, but I can do it.
Oh no, I just wanted to do Martin Kottmeyer's.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay, so this is about the Great Lakes Fireball, which became associated with a Kecksburg UFO case. So this happened in December 1965. And it was seen by, there was a meteor fireball that was seen by many people in many states. Many witnesses came forward later on, but this is like one of those UFO cases which has been retold again and again, and more fantastical elements have been added to it. So yeah, there was a December the 9th, 1965 at around 9:43 p.m. A brilliant bolide was exploding. An exploding bolide was seen over 10 US states in the Canadian province of Ontario. And it lasted for a few seconds. It left like some sort of apparent smoke trail. One researcher estimated that there could have been 1.3 million potential witnesses. Hundreds of witnesses actually came forward. Astronomers resolved this as a meteorite into the atmosphere, probably an asteroid because of the speed, the estimated speed, and things like that. So it was probably, it was almost certainly a meteorite. But there was many people who thought that it had crashed nearby. And this also gets to the issue of people being unable to discern the true distance of something. There was also issues to do with kind of like where exactly it was supposedly landing. Although I don't think they found any actual traces of it, but many people said that they found fragments, but none of these were ever really linked to the UFO or to the sighting. The media became excited by this as well, and they were already the public was already primed for out of this world explanations because of the Gemini launch, right? Or Gemini launches 6 and 7. There was also some UFO speculation going on at the time and stuff like that. So the public was very, aware of these out of world narratives, and of course it got tied into that. The Kecksburg crash. So Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. Now there's an explanation here about like the azimuth and things of that sort. So there's like an initial report, which was, I get confused here reading it, but I think one of the reports was inaccurate, but it sort of stuck in the public mind. But then it wasn't actually the real kind of direction or distance, because one of the authors, one of the UFO enthusiasts, underestimated the actual speed. He messed up like the miles per hour versus miles per minute. So he greatly underestimated the speed. And that sort of messed up like the estimate of where it supposedly landed. The military involvement as well was blown out of proportion. So there was all this talk later on about like army involvement, but actually it was just a couple of Air Force people, or maybe 3, who had been sent to investigate, and the police had cordoned off the area where supposedly it had landed. But that was about it in terms of the government or the police involvement. And lights as well in the woods. So there were reports of flashing lights, but these were probably teenagers running around with a camera, and maybe some reporters photographing the woods. And people were also doing searches of the area. And that also was related to like whether the police or the army were involved, but it appears that just the police were involved in like cordoning off of the area near Kecksburg. And let's see, so witnesses came forward. Some of the ufologists were not very careful in their studies, but like the main UFO groups at the time, NICAP and APRO, they pretty much ignored this case, and they didn't even, in the Colorado study, they didn't even include that as like one of the cases that they sent to the Colorado group.
But it is analyzed in the book in William Hartman's chapter on perceptual issues relating to UFOs.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there was no military really, like the people, like you watch a TV show and they talk about it was like cordoned off. Like the only actual cordoning off that was done was by the local fire department. And that was because they thought there was a fire and they needed to keep the road clear for the fire trucks. And that was just in one place. There was no military cordoning off. There was no army present. That relates to a misidentification of the Air Force Squadron 662, which Blue Book was sent out to investigate cases. So there was the three Air Force officers from there that was in a taxi or a police car or something that somebody saw. that a radio broadcaster saw. And what he put out there was kind of interpreted and like spread out throughout the UFO world, that he saw these army squadron people there, and that's just not actually even accurately what he reported. But that's what people believe to this day, is that there was a big military involvement, even though nobody ever really saw, like, the military there. Just those couple of Air Force officers that were sent by kind of Blue Book to investigate. In fact, the whole this guy's written plenty of articles, but one of his articles that I don't believe was published started off being called Murphy's UFO, is because the guy who kicked this off was this guy John Murphy, who was a news director at a radio station, who advertised basically essentially incorrect crash site on a golf course kind of on the other part of town that's not even near where the fire department and the other kind of people were. And so that kind of got called Murphy's UFO, and kind of started off that whole kind of crash myth in the first place. And it was all just a misidentification in the first place. The guy was in the wrong place, and had to go to a different area of town. So
yeah, and then somebody just noted the Glocke, the neo-Nazi UFO story.
Yeah, the bell. Yeah.
The bell, yeah. Which is, in some tellings, is like a time traveling machine that the SS or Nazis in World War II they developed, and then it crashed in the future. So this is certainly exploded in the fantastical elements. But sorry, I'm trying to get it opened. So yeah, so it went on Unsolved Mysteries as well, and that helped to perpetuate the story to the media and to public awareness. And Cosmos 96, which was a Soviet spacecraft, it was actually one of the spacecraft that they launched destined for Venus, but then it fell out of orbit and fell over Canada. This was also linked to that, but apparently it probably wasn't that. There was also like reports of hieroglyphics, and that also, was tied to the Soviet possible connection, but also possibly to the Nazi acorn Glocke later on. But anyway, that almost certainly was not the cause. Yeah, so the media explosion. So Unsolved Mysteries in September 1990, they did a piece on that. Some inaccurate information was, perpetuated by that show or that episode. And let's see. So there was also talk about alien bodies, because this will, often when there's a crash narrative, alien bodies are sure to follow, and this happened here as well. And
I think can I just point out real quick? Important that the Unsolved Mysteries event is so bad that 45 separate residents and property owners in the area sent in a letter basically saying that it's nonsense. It didn't happen. There was no crash. There was no recovery. Like, you're promoting garbage. So even the local people were like, this is nonsense. It didn't really happen. And earlier in this article, I mentioned the police sheriff or whatever guy said that there was no recovery. We didn't find anything anywhere. Like, there was no bell-shaped object hauled away on truck beds. The TV show Unsolved Mysteries apparently couldn't get a big enough truck. Supposedly it was a 9.5 truck that hauled away this acorn shape, but they could only get a 2.5-ton truck. And so they had to make the acorn smaller. And so now everybody believes the acorn is this size. And that kind of also metamorphized into the propaganda version of Cosmos 96 here. Unfortunately, just like they got 45 people saying it never happened, it also got a whole bunch of brand new witnesses calling up, claiming that they do know about this event, and it did happen. Which you always kind of get when you put something out on a show like Unsolved Mysteries. You're going to get people popping out of the woodwork. But it's important to note, the people that actually lived there, that were there, said nothing was found. There was no crash. There was no recovery. So.
Incidentally, I was watching on Hulu the Unsolved Mysteries episodes about Roswell and cattle mutilations. And they, at the end of the show, they say, if you have any information about these cases, then visit the website. But these things are decades after the events, in some cases, like Roswell for sure. But that is almost like an invitation to confabulate, because that already was happening by the 1980s. But then, like, who's going to remember anything now, right?
And that's why they say right here, later witness accounts of the portrayals of the myth now seem to fit the iconic scene that they saw in Unsolved Mysteries. So these later witnesses were essentially just repeating and reporting the same story they just heard on the television show. So, yeah. This is why I'm always personally very iffy about witnesses that pop up decades after the fact. Like, I don't think they have much value, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. And there was many parallels with another case, the Columbus connection. It talks here about another case from 1954, a crash story, and apparently there are 19 parallels between that and the Scully tale, Frank Scully, which is a fraudulent case. And so some of these were picked up by the Kecksburg case as well. People reporting seeing like bodies and things, and many other elements in that as well, which were similar. Then in the conclusion, it sort of runs down like the evolution of the folklore of these sorts of stories. So like an event with at least one witness, local news interest, involvement of enthusiasts or investigators, additional witnesses, widespread media excitement. As witness stories are refuted, new witness claims appear, and then ufologist theories of an increasingly bizarre nature are developed. Anyway, but I mean, it's yet another sort of microcosm for, looking at how UFO stories become more elaborate over time.
Yep.
I wish that chapter was longer because, I don't know. It was interesting, but I wish that it went into greater historical detail about the original event. It was kind of confusing following the first part of it.
And I say this guy actually did a lot of the kind of research into this case and wrote a couple of articles that I'm not sure, like he wrote one called Old Solved Mysteries, which is, I think, a bit longer than this. And he goes into the kind of details that he doesn't go into in this kind of, I wonder if I can, but nope.
Sorry. Is this what you're looking at?
No,
Oh, sorry.
Why is this old?
Huh? What are you looking for?
Hold on a second. Let me see here. Do you see the Kecksburg thing on my screen right now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. So, so this guy like wrote like a whole bunch of stuff on this case. This Robert Young guy. Somewhere in here, he even breaks. They talk about those 19 cases 19 similarities between that crash. Like, see, this is part of a 17+ page article called Murphy's like UFO that he wrote, where he breaks down all these little kind of details. But one of these papers that he wrote, he actually talks about like all the similarities for that case between that Columbus, Ohio case that he says is similar. But sorry, I meant to have this kind of like up, but my computer crashed the other day. And so there's a lot more in this. I'm just not sure if any of this was actually ever published. Like, he had sent this article into the CUFOs to be published by the International UFO Studies, but I'm not sure it like ever actually happened. But yeah, so there's a lot in this case you could like dig into. This guy was really kind of spurred on by the Unsolved Mysteries episode and trying to set some of this nonsense kind of like straight. So
Yeah, I would like to learn more about it. I heard someone saying on like a podcast recently that the Kecksburg case had some merit to it, but I never understood like why someone would say something like that. But
Yeah. Anyways, I can't find what I
yeah,
was.
it's interesting in terms of just like myth making and stuff like that. And I mean, there was an actual meteor involved, which is cool.
Yeah. Anyway. So yeah, it's
I don't know. I don't really have a lot to say about this chapter. It felt like it was just like sort of like an outline of the case, and I wish that it went into more detail.
yeah, it's kind of a summary of I would say his longer articles that he kind of originally wrote for the case. He does have an article also on the case for Skeptical Inquirer called "Old Solved Mysteries: The Kecksburg Incident," which again I believe is probably kind of a more summarized version of that Old Solved Mysteries article. His original manuscript he sent a copy of that I have in that file there. So
And that file is the swords file.
it was Ufo's Kecksburg file. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And is that available somewhere? Is that available on AFU or Kufos or something like that?
I don't think so. Maybe it might be actually it might be. Yeah, I think it might be actually. I'm not sure. I'd have to check.
Okay.
But
Did you share that in the Discord? Because I felt like
so.
I was
Maybe.
like I felt like I saw that picture of the acorn monument like recently, and I kept thinking that it was in the chapter. That's why I was like scrolling around looking through the chapter because I'm like, where's the acorn?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting because again, a lot of
the memory acorn illustration.
A lot of the kind of reason for a long time, this case was kind of always explained as, either like the Cosmos 96 or like a reentry event. But, it turns out that that's not actually a legit explanation for the case. It's just a kind of a normal another fireball or meteor kind of event, but not a reentry event is the most likely explanation for this case. And when you have something like a well-known large-scale fireball event seen across several states, that happened at the same time as this supposed UFO event. Again, I think the most likely explanation is that it was the fireball, that it was not a UFO that people saw. And as like Louise mentioned, a lot of the errors in this case where that kind of continue to perpetuate the UFO myth here. One of the main things people talk about this case is that this object seemed to change course or directions, and a fireball, of course, wouldn't change course or directions or have any sort of maneuverability per se, and so it can't be a fireball. But again, this is all based on bogus maps first put out by Ivan Sanderson, who had written a news article about this story that was sent over the kind of the wires, and then I believe he also later discussed in his books where he published a map of sightings, and only this map was inaccurate. Like it was a bad map that he drew, and he collected these reports not by talking to witnesses, but by calling up a couple of police offices, and talking to the police desk, asking them what people had reported or seen in. And so there was no real kind of like firsthand investigation or speaking to any actual witnesses. And he created this map based on this kind of limited or bad information he had. And that map has been perpetuated in things like Stan Gordon. It continues to be perpetuated by people like Stan Gordon and like Unsolved Mysteries and other things. And that's kind of how you get this false idea that like a crash took place in the wrong place, this object changed positions. And it's because there's just fundamental problems with this original map that was published based on bad data. So, yeah, it jump-started the entire thing that there was actually a slow-moving UFO that could maneuver instead of it being just a fireball that was moving pretty fastly. So this is what happens when you have bad information that just gets copied and pasted and repeated again throughout, UFO history. and these whole kind of mythologies and narratives get built on cases that were relatively unremarkable in the first place. I mean, seeing a giant fireball is cool. That's very cool, but it's not a UFO.
Yeah, and the reason that there are, I don't know, I need to study this case more, but it sounded like that it was like a bolide that exploded or something like that, so it didn't leave an impact, and so nobody was able to find like a location where it came down or a quote unquote crash site.
Yeah, but at least in this case, fortunately, they were through photos that were taken, not just one photo, but photos taken in different locations. They were, able to do real triangulations of the path of the fireball and determine that this fireball actually was nowhere near Kecksburg. Like it would have flown over, I think, like they said Philadelphia, but like not Kecksburg. Like it didn't actually. So again, distances, people misperceiving distances, thinking something's a lot closer than it really was, because some people really did believe the reason the fire department was out there in the first place is because people thought an airplane crashed. They reported that there was an airplane crash in like the woods or whatever, and so that's why the fire department came out in the first place.
Yeah, he says that in the chapter too, how like a lot of the witnesses were saying that they saw it like go down just like over the trees, or like just the next house over and stuff like that, just because they're their perception is completely misinterpreting the distance.
Yeah. But like I said, so fortunately in this case, there was photos taken from multiple places that they were able to calculate, actual paths and kind of figure this stuff out. We don't always have that in these fireball cases. A lot of times the case, almost certainly is a fireball, like, based on description and what people report seeing, but short of, like cameras and stuff, people taking photos, like it's hard to come up with an exact path.
All right. Anything you wanted to add, Luis? All right. Okay, and for our final story, hold on a second.
Oh my gosh, that guy's scary.
And for our final story, the inaugural Rio Grande Sky Fiesta comes to Alcalde this weekend. This coming weekend, a new balloon festival called the Rio Grande Sky Fiesta will be held at Los Cruces historic site in the small village of Alcalde near Española in New Mexico. The location has been inhabited for over 1,000 years and is near the Oque Owinge Pueblo. The festival will feature 15 hot air balloons, including a balloon in the shape of a zozobra, a traditional giant effigy burned on Labor Day in Santa Fe. The event will continue into the evening with a balloon glow when balloons are flown while glowing at night. In a related story, earlier this month, Albuquerque, New Mexico held its 52nd annual International Balloon Fiesta, which hosted hot air balloon launches and drone displays. The festival did not go off without a hitch, as there were 4 separate balloon-related incidents. One balloon struck power lines and caught fire, but was able to land safely and without any passengers being injured. Another balloon toppled a radio tower, the second time that this tower has been struck by a balloon in 2 decades. In another incident, a balloon's carriage became lodged in a tree, resulting in 1 head injury. And finally, after a balloon hit a power line, it caused a power outage to 13,000 homes in Albuquerque. Last Thursday, students of South Valley Academy, a 6-12 charter school in Albuquerque, launched a high-altitude solar-powered balloon. The students are tracking the balloon using GPS, as well as collecting data on temperature, gas pressure, payload, and the effects on biological samples. The experiment was made possible through a collaboration with Sandia National Laboratories and Science Heads Incorporated, a member organization of the NASA Museum and Informal Education Alliance. Before we go, if you enjoy this show, we would like you to please consider subscribing to our channel, Ufo Sunset. And internet live chat. I'm sorry?
Oh, I think you froze for a sec.
Oh, okay. And come and join our cozy and intimate live chat. A great plus for joining the live chat is that you can give us constructive feedback live on the air, especially if we make any factual errors. You can also join our Discord, a temporary link to which can be found in the episode description. And I believe I already added that, but if not, I'll add it after the show. Here at Ufos, our political and personal views are not the same, and the work of each of us is independent work. Personal views or positions expressed in individual pieces are not those of Ufos, who is not a person and has no views, or myself. Please be sure to check out our respective content. I can be found in the quantum ether. Visit Luis, I'm having trouble saying your name today for some reason. Visit Luis Cayetano's website, ufologyiscorrupt.com, or you will be launched into space like a Sputnik rocket. And you can find Jeff Knox's daily posts on history and the science of UFOs on Twitter or Facebook. Jeff Knox spends all of his time studying UFOs, and he doesn't make hardly any money off of it. Please consider visiting his Patreon page and becoming his patron, or visiting his Ko-Fi page and becoming his Ko-Fi-in. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Luis. Thank you so much to Martin Kottmeyer for your wonderful detailed critique. Thank you to Rich, Amy Collins, Simon Fly, Timothy Brigham, Tim Brigham, Heather, or is it Heather? Brady, and I feel like there was someone else here. Oh yeah, Stephanie, thank you so much for being here tonight. It's wonderful to see you. And also, thank you to... Oh, so many people showed up in the chat. I think that's everyone now. Whoa, a lot of chat. And also thank you to Kevin for being Jeff's patron. And in the words of the disc, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine.